Hello there, I'm Alan Stanley. I'm the Knowledge Manager in the Knowledge Impact and Policy Cluster at IDS. I'd like to welcome you to this session, which is on evidence quality frameworks and synthesis. So in this session, we're going to look at some definitions of different types of evidence. And then we're going to look at some different hierarchies of types of evidence as a way to think about what we mean when we talk about evidence quality. Building on that, we'll look at some dimensions of an evidence quality framework as a practical tool that will help us to review what evidence is out there to address a particular policy problem. And then the exercise this week is to design a simple evidence synthesis that takes into consideration some of these dimensions of evidence quality that we've discussed. So two quick disclaimers to bear in mind here when we talk about types of evidence. We're going to focus a lot in this session on research evidence, but I think it's important to remember that research isn't the only kind of evidence out there. Much of the evidence used in decision making isn't research, government statistics, for example. And also when we talk about research evidence, what we generally mean is research findings, so the outputs of research. But it's important to remember that the doing of research has many benefits to decision-making processes as well, beyond just the production of results and findings. It brings people together, it creates dialogue, it gives a voice to groups that might not otherwise be heard, or it can. So it has value beyond just reports and findings, and I think it's important in thinking about this course as a whole to remember and keep that in mind. Okay, so you might recognize this slide from James's opening presentation. And there are many different ways that you could break down the different types of evidence. You know, research studies are usually described as being primary or secondary research. So primary, which is about collecting, analysing and presenting new data, or secondary, which is about summarising, interrogating or comparing different primary sources. And James talked about experimental methods like randomized control trials and more observational methods that perhaps focus on capturing and communicating the lived experiences of people in relation to a particular issue. And these are examples of primary research. And then he also discussed the multiple types of evidence synthesis, so more secondary research, and we'll come on to talk more about these later on in this session. So we're not going to spend time on these sort of detailed definitions of types of evidence here, but I think it's worth noting for now that the definitions focus on methods. They focus on the approach taken or the study design, if you like, rather than the eventual use of evidence. And that becomes important when we start to think about how we organise these types of evidence into what we think of as good quality or poor quality evidence. So this is a traditional hierarchy of evidence pyramid. It's something that if you've had any background in the health sector, you may well have come across in some form or other. It's quite widely used. And you can see it describes evidence in terms of study design. So with weaker study design at the bottom, from opinion through kind of different forms of primary research, and then more reliable evidence at the top. So evidence synthesis of the body of evidence on a topic, not just single studies. So we say more reliable evidence, but what do we mean by more reliable? Well, in this case, what we're talking about is the extent to which the study design eliminates bias, eliminates error from creeping into the results. So in this hierarchy, experimental methods are privileged more highly than other primary methods because they're felt to eliminate error and eliminate bias more strongly in their design. And evidence synthesis methods come out on top because by drawing together and comparing evidence from across a range of sources, that should reduce the risk of error compared to what might creep in a single study. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware there's a whole debate around the relative merits of different study designs, particularly in relation to sort of primary evidence generation. So whether experimental is really better than observational. And we're not going to go into that in any detail here, but a lot of that is about whose knowledge counts when it comes to evidence use. So, a scientist's findings based on experimental data more useful or valid for decision making than observational studies that capture the views and lived experiences of those affected by the problem. And we'll be coming back to that discussion. I guess the other aspect of study design when thinking about quality is to consider how well the type of research being conducted helps you to answer the question that you have. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but for example, if you have a question about whether a particular intervention works, then that may push you towards a particular types of evidence, say towards evaluations or randomized control trials, for example, that might be more helpful in providing evidence to answer that question. If you want to understand the causes or extent of a problem, then you might want to look at more observational methods or more observational study designs and so on. So that's another aspect to bear in mind when we think about what we mean by quality. So kind of applicability, I guess you call it. So going back to the evidence hierarchies, let's look at a different way of thinking about those. So this is from Howard White, who proposed this variation to that sort of traditional evidence hierarchy a couple of years ago. So again, in this one, you have individual studies at the bottom, with synthesis slightly above that. But then he's also added this idea of evidence brokerage at the top. So this is where synthesis undergoes kind of further translation and curation to produce at this kind of higher level targeted learning or recommendations or guidance. So let's compare these two. The assumption in both pyramids is that the evidence at the top of the pyramid is better than the evidence of the bottom. There's some measure of quality involved, but slightly different definitions of quality are being used here. So in the standard pyramid, as we've said, it's primarily about academic rigor and study design. How well does the method of producing and publishing that research eliminate the risk of error and bias? But Howard White's pyramid is defining quality as something different. It's taking it as given, if you like, that a robust methodology has been used. And it's presenting the hierarchy in terms of this level of curation or translation that's been applied, with the assumption that the higher levels of translation that have occurred, the more useful the presentation of the evidence is to the decision maker. So this is a useful concept for us. I think that quality isn't just about study design and academic rigor, that it could also be thought of in terms of how usefully that evidence is being presented to decision makers. It's worth saying though that this is still very much a sort of supply side view, and it's essentially expressing what researchers think decision makers should find useful. And as we'll see, that isn't always borne out by reality. So what do we know about what policymakers might actually value? Well, so in this slide, the two pyramids to the right, these are my sort of simplified summary of some research from Indonesia, which asked policymakers in different branches of government what they valued in terms of evidence. So in the executive branch, so among civil servants and government officials, and then also among legislators, so among elected officials, those who make the laws. And then the pyramid on the left, that's essentially a rough combination of the two previous pyramids, the researcher's view of what's important, if you like, and is primarily about rigorous study design and translation and curation, as we've discussed. And I've roughly translated the terms to fit the categories from the Indonesia research so that it makes the three pyramids a bit more comparable. So if you look at the executive branch in the middle, you can see there that the executive branch broadly values evidence in the same way that researchers think they should, if you like. They put statistics top, but otherwise the pyramids are fairly similar in terms of the hierarchies there. And statistics being on top isn't a big surprise, I think. It's not unusual, I think, for government officials to rely on government data more than they rely on external forms of evidence. So maybe no big surprises there, but what's more shocking, at least for those of us from a research background, is what is the pyramid there on the right, what the legislators value. So research studies and expertise, here are the least valuable form of evidence for them. And what they value most is essentially information on what the people that vote for them think about an issue. So whether that's portrayed through the media or directly from public opinion. And then below that, sort of practical lessons about what works, so evaluations and lessons from practice. So what should we take from that? Well, maybe just that when thinking about what constitutes good evidence, we also need to take account of our stakeholders' needs, and think from their point of view about what's going to be important for them. And that consideration should be an aspect of how we consider quality as well, I would argue. So we've got an idea of some areas to think about. So let's talk now about what frameworks there are that can help us to identify evidence that meets our needs in terms of quality. And there are many and multiple frameworks out there. And these include things like the DFID guidance, which is used internally within the UK government to help them think about what evidence should be considered to inform decision making. There are things like the GRADE, which is a tool for grading the quality of evidence for systematic reviews, produced by the Campbell collaboration. So very much a kind of a high quality gold standard type approach to really rigorous evidence synthesis. And each of these frameworks tends to reflect the needs and values of the organization that designed it. And so it's likely that none will be entirely suitable for your needs. But we're going to focus on one framework here, and that's the IDRC one. So that's the RQ Plus, the Research Quality Plus framework produced by IDRC in Canada. And I've chosen to focus on that one for 3 reasons, and one of them is actually that it very closely matches kind of IDS values about how research should be done. So it expresses quality in a way that values not just that traditional academic definition of quality, but also talks about co-construction of knowledge with local partners and the communities being studied. So the legitimacy aspects of quality, and also it focuses on impact. So under that positioning for use. So it's a good fit, and I think we should be upfront about that. It's a good fit for how IDS sees research. But in terms of the course, it's also the most comprehensive and holistic in its vision of what constitutes research quality, and brings in some of these other aspects that we've been talking about to do with usefulness of research and applicability of different types of research for answering different kinds of questions. And lastly, because it's quite practical and multi-purpose in the sense that it can be used to assess an existing body of evidence as part of a process of evidence synthesis, but also potentially, and actually it's primarily designed as a means of evaluating research design, so to see whether a research study or a program is going to be effective in achieving the impact that you're looking for. So you can see it defines quality as falling into these sort of 4 dimensions, and I'm just going to go into those in a little bit more detail to explain what they mean. So the first dimension is research integrity, and this is essentially the classic academic definition of quality based around study design that we've already discussed. So I'm not going to go back through that again. This dimension is most commonly assessed by external peer review. And I just wanted to talk briefly here about peer review and how that relates to the publication of research in peer-reviewed journals. But the peer review process and the process of academic publishing more broadly is not without its issues, and it's worth just briefly highlighting that. It's a fairly old, dare I say, archaic process, and there's fairly good evidence in development studies, at least, that the process of selecting articles for peer-reviewed journals privileges certain mainly northern institutions and authors, and often excludes those from smaller, non-US, non-UK organisations for a variety of reasons. And there are also questions about whether the process of peer review really delivers the kind of robust assessment of research integrity that journals would claim. And I can point you to a lot of literature on this if you're interested, but for now I think it's just something to bear in mind, particularly when it comes to thinking about evidence selection, that if we choose to exclude non-peer reviewed literature from our evidence search, then that again potentially has implications for whose voice is being heard and whose knowledge counts. So the second IDRC dimension is in some ways linked to that, actually, and it's called research legitimacy. And here, you know, the RQ Plus framework is already moving beyond what most of these other assessment frameworks would consider when thinking about quality of evidence. So it's largely talking about kind of ethics and safeguarding, so ensuring appropriate measures are in place to minimize the risk of anything bad happening as a result of the research to any of the participants or populations being studied. But it also has this aspect of inclusiveness of vulnerable populations, so making sure that in the way the research is designed, that, you know, that we're ensuring the interests and views of vulnerable, marginalized communities or populations are represented. And linked to that, you know, that research design also addresses issues of gender roles and norms, of identities, yeah, including other intersectional identities. So ensuring that, you know, disaggregated data is collected and analysed, but also, you know, recognition of the need for different solutions for different identity groups. And then that final category is important also around engagement with local knowledge. So this is about making sure that research includes communities and populations and local research organisations in, you know, in the research in an appropriate and credible manner. And that, yeah, that's both participation in the research process itself, but also in making sure that, you know, the findings of that research are accessible and useful to those communities in appropriate ways, so that it's not a, you know, just a wholly extractive process. The third dimension, research importance, well, you know, so originality is about, you know, kind of whether the research is making a contribution to kind of conceptual and theoretical innovation. So that one's not so important, I guess, a criteria for us when it comes to thinking about evidence use. But relevance, you know, is very central. I think, you know, relevance is talking about the extent to which the research is answering or solving a problem, yeah, that's a proven sort of priority for stakeholders, that it aligns with kind of development policies and priorities, or that it's focusing on a kind of emerging problem that's likely to, you know, to demand solutions in the near future. And then the last one is this idea of positioning for use. So making sure that the research is targeted at specific identified stakeholder groups, that it takes account of their context and their needs. Yeah, and that includes, you know, the extent to which you know, their perspectives and assumptions might align or differ from you know, from those of the research producers. And then timeliness and actionability. This is the extent to which the research is able to respond to a particular policy window or, you know, a particular opportunity. So that could be having, you know, just having the right evidence available at the right time, or it could equally about, you know, what we've talked about already in terms of taking account of sort of individual or organisational capacities and their ability to respond to the findings of what the research says. So as well as defining these kind of 4 dimensions of quality, RQ Plus sets out indicators or rubrics to help you measure the extent to which a particular, you know, study or research design performs against each of these categories. So hopefully you can see that, by considering these different dimensions of quality, this can help us when it comes to thinking about how we might design a strategy to identify the right evidence to address a specific policy question, or if necessary, design a research strategy from scratch. So I'm not going to go into research design. That would be a whole new course, and I wouldn't be the right person to be talking about that. But I'm going to talk briefly about evidence synthesis, because your workbook exercise that I want you to do this week is about applying some of these definitions or dimensions of research quality to a simple design for an evidence synthesis study. So when we talk about evidence synthesis, we mean, as we've said, these studies that bring together the body of evidence on an issue from a range of individual studies. And they're, and that's a useful thing to do for a number of reasons. Again, as we've already discussed, it helps to address bias and reduce the likelihood of error. If multiple studies find the same thing, it's more likely that they're right. It also, it can help also to describe, variation and differences in understanding, across a body of research, and also to help identify any gaps, any gaps in knowledge. It can also help to update or summarize the state of the art on an issue, or our current best understanding of an issue. And all of those, are things that can be useful and can help make evidence accessible for decision makers. And they can also directly inform policy decisions and justify or provide a justification for a course of action by giving an assessment of the impact of particular interventions, for example. So there are lots of different types of evidence synthesis. Traditional literature reviews, which are good for summarising this, that kind of state of the art, and are useful for policy audiences because they can be, kind of quite quick, quite responsive, in providing an overview of knowledge around an urgent policy question. Then there are things like systematic reviews, which are much bigger, longer term, expensive pieces of work, and tend to look very much for impact. So does intervention X really result in outcome Y? And so systematic reviews are often used in policy to justify a course of action because they're considered highly rigorous. They have a very systematic and transparent methodology, multiple reviewers, etc. So they're considered, as I've said before, a kind of a gold standard of evidence synthesis. And then there are also things like evidence maps, which are good at giving a comprehensive review of what's out there, describing the range of understanding on an issue, and are useful for spotting gaps or identifying research priorities to fill those gaps. So many different types, but I think most have some common features. So most evidence synthesis will start with a research question that sets the parameters and boundaries, if you like, for the search and retrieval of available research literature, so the evidence collection. They will set criteria for screening to identify what types and quality of evidence is relevant. And then there'll be some form of analysis looking at what evidence is there, how comprehensive it is or not, what the gaps are, how robust the evidence is or not, and what it tells us about the answer to our research question. And then there's an element which is about presentation, so organising the evidence in a useful way and presenting that analysis in a way that's useful for the end user. So for the workbook exercise this week, I'm going to ask you to have a go at those first two elements, if you like, in designing your own synthesis product. And I think that that's a useful exercise in itself, but I think what I'm more interested in is that you then kind of reflect on your design in light of what we've discussed in relation to evidence quality, and consider kind of how well your design reflects those different dimensions of the RQ+ framework. How important are they in helping you to answer your question? So you can use either the case study that you're working on in your case study groups, or you can use an example of a policy problem for your own experience. Either is fine. And so I want you to think about the policy change that you're looking for in relation to that problem, and based on that, come up with a research question that would help you to identify relevant evidence to help you answer or address that problem. And then I want you to think about, firstly, what types of evidence would be appropriate to answering that question. And then secondly, where would you find that? Where would you go to look for that kind of evidence? What would be the source of relevant evidence for answering your question? And then, as I've said, once you've done that, I'd like you to reflect on how well your design reflects those different kind of dimensions of quality. So just quickly, a couple of sort of top tips, if you like, to help you with the exercise. It might help you for defining your research question to use this population intervention comparator and outcome framework, or PICO. This helps you to, it's helpful in that it helps you to break down the research question in a way that sort of helps you to focus, if you like. So, so when we talk about population, that's who are we looking at? Is it a particular subgroup within a given population? Are we restricting our search for evidence to a specific country or region or set of countries? Intervention is, are we looking at the impact of a particular kind of program or an event, or the result of a change that took place of some sort? Is there a comparison group that we would use to compare the outcomes of our intervention? So that could be a comparable group in a different geographic context, a different social group. It could be a range of things. And then outcomes are, what are the which outcome or set of outcomes are we interested in as a result of the intervention? And you can also, there's also a T you could add to the end of this, which is time frame. Is it useful to restrict your search to a particular time frame? For example, the time that's elapsed since a particular policy came into force. So I've done a quick example on the right there of a PICO style research question. So what is the evidence that involvement of participants in the Shaping Policy with Evidence short course has increased the use of theory of change methods and improved the use of evidence in decision making by their host organisations compared to similar organisations who have not participated in this training in the last 3 years. So it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but hopefully you can see that, so the intervention there is the involvement of participants in the course. The outcome is the increased use of theory of change methods and improved use of evidence in decision making. The comparator would be similar organisations who haven't sent anyone on the course. The time frame being the last 3 years since this course started. So I hope that kind of gives you an idea of and a useful tool to help you frame your research question. And then my other top tip would, there's a very good and kind of easy to read guide to producing this kind of evidence synthesis that I'd recommend you check out if you want, as a useful kind of set of guidance, and that's the how to do a rigorous evidence-focused literature review in international development, and that's also in the reading list with a link in the workbook. Okay, so that's it for today. These are just the readings and references from today's session. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you all again shortly. Thanks very much.